Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Cycle Two Step Forward podcast with myself, Chris and my co-host
Beverley Ann. Hello.
Hi everyone, and today we've got an amazing guest. Our special guest is Fay Maxted from the Survivors Trust. Now, Fay, can you just introduce yourself to our listeners, our watchers? Just give us a little bit of detail about yourself and why you do what you do.
Right, okay. Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Beverley. And thank you for inviting me. It's great. Okay. I think I had a normal family, usual family growing up. Unfortunately, I didn't have a normal neighbour who was very very unpleasant. And so as a child growing up, I didn't know any different. But when I reached sort of young, I don't know, 12, maybe 11 or 12. And you have to think back in those days, because I'm getting quite on in years these days.
Oh, you'd never guess, Fay.
Back in those days, there was no sex education for under 10s. And, you know, it was only until secondary school where, you know, you started to find out about the birds and the bees. And it was at that point that I realised what had happened when I was very small. I was probably about 3 years old. And
oh, wow.
It, you know, I have no memory of how long it continued for, but certainly by the time I started school, it had stopped. But it wasn't until all those years later that it dawned on me what had happened. And I felt so ashamed and so guilty. I didn't tell anyone at all. And so despite having, you know, a loving mum and dad, you know, I certainly grew up with an awful lot of very negative feelings and a lot of unhappiness. I suppose years later, I went back into adult education, and I was interested in research, to be honest. But while I was studying, one of the other students said to me, I think you'd be really good on this helpline that I volunteer for. So I said, okay, you know, I've got 4 young children to bring up. I'm studying the full time. Why not? Let's volunteer on a helpline.
Let's do some more.
Yeah, let's do a bit more. And so I went along, and that was for Rosa in rugby.
And what does Rosa stand for?
Rape or sexual abuse.
Okay.
And so I joined the helpline team there. I did their training, which fabulous training back in those days. It was very comprehensive. It looked at the impact of sexual violence and abuse. It looked at ways of working with victims and survivors. And it was a really progressive agency. They were working with everyone across the board. So, you know, I was really happy to join them. The training was a revelation because I remember sitting there and listening to the trainer talking about the impact of childhood sexual abuse and ticking off this long list of depression, flashbacks, panic attacks, nightmares, all the usual trauma symptoms that you think of. And I sat there in the group thinking, oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes, that's me. That's me. I recognise that. And I suppose in a way it was, and I think a lot of therapists go through this process. It's in learning about this that actually you start to discover your own inner workings and own responses. So that's what I did. And having gone into the voluntary sector like that, I've stayed there. And eventually at Rosa, you know, applied to become the manager there and took on that role too. And really I suppose in a way it was trying to put things right. It's using what's gone wrong to help make things better and to put things right for other people. And that's a big driver, I think, around why I do what I do. And I think
Absolutely.
people do what they do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Breaking that cycle, isn't it? You know, and the power of knowledge.
Yes, if you don't know, you don't know.
No, you don't. And what people don't understand, which you've shared so eloquently, you know, you were a young child, and then once you realise what was happening, the shame and the guilt that comes with that, and yet you're a young child. It's not your fault in any way, shape or form. And even when you're older, it's not your fault when you've been abused, but it's innate in that shame and that guilt, isn't it, that follows on.
It's very difficult. And of course, when as an adult, you feel with adult emotions. So it's an adult sense of guilt and shame placed onto a child who absolutely didn't understand what was happening.
Absolutely. Chris, you wanted to add something.
So I got a long list of questions for you, and we are stuck on question 1 already, as in there's loads to ask you about. When you are in your loving, caring, nurturing household with mum and dad, were there any telltale signs that you had gone through something horrific in your behaviour, the way you presented? Would there have been any way, shape or form that your parents could have picked up on it, could have asked you different questions, or was the language and the era, it just wasn't something that was spoken about or known about?
It certainly wasn't something that was spoken about or even thought about. And I think even at the age of 15, when I did try and tell my mum, I don't think she could take it on board.
Right.
You know, she said, "Oh, I always thought he was such a nice man."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is a crippling thing to hear when you're trying to say something which is so taboo and so it seems so awful and so big. So I don't think so. I mean, I performed really well at school. I was always, achieving at school. So I don't think it had a negative impact in that way particularly, but yeah, I don't think they would have known.
But what was the impact on you, Fay? How did you feel? You've talked about the shame and the guilt, but how did it show up and present for you? If you want, given the signs out to those around you, but how did it make you feel? Drive that productivity.
No feeling of self-worth, no feeling, no self-esteem at all, which I think was driving the achieving at school, to try and have something to demonstrate that I could do. That
you was good enough,
Yeah. And I think even still, I think if you grow up without self-esteem, it's really difficult to hang on to it. You know, to carefully pull together the things that make you feel worthwhile and that you do have self-esteem. But it's very easy for somebody to nudge your elbow and suddenly you've dropped a few things that were making you feel okay. It's, I think you have to work at it.
Absolutely.
A lot of survivors have to continually work at maintaining that and reminding themselves.
And that's something that's always important, and something that's very easy for us all with life to start putting that self-care aside. But it's vital, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think it's the things that make life sweet that make such a difference. You have to have those things that bring you something, which is, it's different to work, it's different to family or relationships. It's just for you and it makes you feel good, or it gives you some fun. It sort of takes you out of your thoughts. Yeah.
Going back to this question, and just in the media the last 2 days, sex education, relationship education, it's all very topical at the moment.
Yeah.
You shared you didn't have the sex education until secondary school, yet you were abused at the age of 3. Now, research shows, and you're hot on this topic, Faye, research shows that a lot of the abuse happens to children under 5, as well as that 5 to 10 age bracket. So all of these people out there that are going, education shouldn't happen in schools, it's up to the parents, and then we're coming along and saying, well, I know I come along and say, well, don't you know that most of the abuse happens within the family home? Don't you realise that parents won't want their children to know about sex education, relationship education, because if they are the offender, they won't want their children having that information. They won't want them having the awareness and the education. But from where we work, the sector that we work in, it's important that children and young people have this education and awareness.
I think you're right, but I think it's how it's done and in what manner and what's driving it and the ideology that's behind it. And I think some sex education has sort of started to miss the point of what they're supposed to be teaching children. And I also think that within sex education, relationships should be prime importance. It's all right knowing the mechanics, but if you haven't got the maturity or the developmental age to make sense of it, it's really not going to make the difference that we want it to. I also think that whilst educating children is good, I think we should be educating adults much more on what to look for and what to say and what to do. It's the child is not the one who should be taking responsibility.
Absolutely.
An adult.
And as and Chris has had this experience as well. Some people say that children don't disclose. Well, that's not true, because you've done that. Chris has been there. It's the adults that chose not to listen.
That's right. And so many times we hear that, and even from professionals where survivors have disclosed as children to doctors, to teachers, and nothing happens. And the sexual abuse continues. So it's
I agree with you that it's never the child's responsibility to disclose, protect others, etc., etc. But if they don't have the education and awareness, then they're never going to be able to speak up, because they just don't have the words, the tools to do so. And as I said, where we can know, then we can speak of. But when what we don't know, we don't know. We've already said that. So it is a form of protection, not a form of responsibility, but it is a form of protection, because I've heard so many people say, once I knew that it was definitely wrong, I felt it was wrong, but when I knew it was wrong, and when I spoke up, or when I said no, because some did find the courage to say no, then it did stop. So for me, it is all about the relationship with self first and foremost, understanding, what love is, what care is, what nurture is, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, whatever age appropriate language you want to use, teachings, but then moving that on. And I feel that's really important.
I think we're all agreed and very passionate about that.
Okay, so moving on, Faye, as a chief executive, a CEO, what does your daily life look like, your work life look like, operationally and strategically?
Okay, so I'm just going to look at my
your calendar.
Calendar for a typical day.
And just to clarify for anyone listening or watching, you're not at Rosa now.
No, she's at the Survivors Trust.
At Rosa now.
You're at Survivors Trust. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes. So on a typical day, I mean, obviously the first thing I start off with is checking my calendar for meetings and my emails to see what's come in. And there can be a whole variety of things. I attend a lot of national meetings, a lot of meetings with member agencies who maybe you know, they might want to ask specific questions about what's happening in their area. They might be interested in giving feedback about funding that they've received. I meet with my teams regularly, so I'm, you know, meeting with the whole team once a week, and we each feedback about what we've been doing. So we, you know, from our helpline, we hear about the kind of calls that are coming through, the kind of issues, and our helpline is very busy and takes a lot of repeat callers too. So people who aren't able to find any help in the community where they are, or not enough help. So also hearing from our training team, we deliver a diploma qualification for independent sexual violence advisors, and a whole range of bespoke training to all kinds of organisations, corporate organisations, government departments. So hearing from that team about what they've been up to. And then we're running quite a few projects as well. One, which is Employers Against Abuse, which is recruiting ambassadors in employment situations who can support their employers and their colleagues to have a greater awareness of domestic and sexual violence. And we're also running free training workshops for independent sexual violence advisors, and that's been funded by the Ministry of Justice. So, you know, all our teams get together, we're sharing a lot of information. Within that, we also provide a lot of support to our member agencies. We have over 120 member agencies across the UK. They're all individual charities in their own right, all working with victims and survivors, and in total probably working with around 120,000 victims and survivors each year.
Wow.
And we run regional members meetings for them and specialist forums. So we have forums for trustees, for chief execs, for clinical leads, for helpline leads, for fundraisers, and for ISVAs, independent sexual violence advisors as well. And there might be one or two others that I've not thought of. So we'll check in each week, see what's happening, and see what other projects are coming up. This week as well, you know, my working days included meetings with NHS England London and also MOPAC's Victims Reference Group. So it's busy, and you know, within that as well, I'll be working on funding bids with our funding team, and contributing to training, developing training, and sometimes delivering training. So it's every day is different.
Yeah.
And I thought I was busy, Bev.
Exactly.
I think she's just blown us out of the water.
And I'm also very proud to say that I've actually completed the ambassador training for an advisor in the workplace.
Oh, excellent.
So yes, I am one of those people. So if there's anyone listening and they're interested in more information, contact us, because we will put the Survivors Trust details below the podcast or the video so that people can contact to find out more, because it's so important, isn't it, Fay?
It is. And again, it comes back to knowledge. It comes back to what you know, and what you know you can do, and where you know you can go.
Absolutely.
Hey, building upon your answer that you've just given, can you tell us a little bit more about Check With Me First and your involvement with research, your involvement with Silver Command? Because people just don't realise how much you do. And I think it needs to be applauded, and I think it needs to be shared.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I mean, I'm really happy to talk about Check With Me First. So that project came about with some funding that we were originally given by NHS England London, and it was intended to raise awareness of the needs of victims and survivors of sexual violence and abuse, and how health practitioners and health staff could work more effectively and really encourage victims and survivors to take up invites to medical tests and exams, things like cervical smears, prostate checks, which we know survivors avoid. You know, anything, I think,
Intimate.
anything which involves being examined, being in that vulnerable position is difficult for many survivors, and that includes going to the dentist, even occupational therapy, physiotherapy, but in particular going to the GP, going to hospitals. So we knew there was a huge need there from survivors, and that it wasn't being met by NHS practitioners who just weren't aware for the most part. And I'm not talking about people who are working in sexual assault referral centres. I'm talking about people who are working in general surgery wards or ambulance people. And so we developed this training, and we've been running it for probably about 3 years now, and really reaching out and training hospital departments. We've had a lot of interest from maternity departments in how to make their engagement with people and women who are pregnant the most supportive it can be. And again, in pregnancy and labour, lots of exams, lots of feeling very vulnerable. And we've also worked with King's College, with Elsa Montgomery, Professor Elsa Montgomery, to develop really resources to support midwives and maternity staff to understand what that experience is like going through childbirth, when you are likely to be triggered by many of the experiences that you're going through. So really important, crucial stuff, I think. And, I'm so mindful that with survivors, when you've experienced trauma and your body has experienced trauma, it has an impact on the immune system. And we see so many more, research shows so many more incidences of cancers and autoimmune conditions in survivors. And yet the thought that survivors are deterred from accessing healthcare because they fear they're going to be triggered. It's absolutely need to change that, and need to make sure that health staff understand that the little changes they can make will make a huge difference to someone who's already worried about their health, but then also worried that whatever procedure they're going to have is going to have a negative impact on them. And it doesn't take a lot, just a bit of humanity and kindness, but a bit of thought, asking, do you mind if the door's open, or do you want the door closed? Do you mind if you see a woman or a man? Do you mind if, just explaining to someone fully what you're going to do? And it sounds, and I don't want to sound like medical practitioners aren't doing that already, but they're busy people. And sometimes that little bit of time goes by the way.
And in all fairness, Chris and I have spoken about childbirth, etc., and the triggers. And like you say, until you're aware and you can reflect back, and we try and share that. And I know for myself with a dentist, even just walking into a dentist, my heart starts pounding.
Yeah.
But there was somebody that I went to 3 years ago, and I never went back again. And when I walked into the room, I actually said, "Oh, hello." And then there was a photograph. It's like, "Is that your family?" And they just literally cut me off and said, "Get in the chair." And straight away, that is a huge trigger, because I'm trying to connect before you put me in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, that's yeah, and I think dentists as well, it seems to come as a huge surprise to some dentists that you know, survivors of childhood sexual abuse might have issues around being prone in a chair, having someone close to them. Yeah, and very often, you know, it's a surprise. It comes as a surprise to find that out, but also then very driven to make things different, and that's wonderful. You know,
Absolutely.
to see change. And how people are really driven to make changes when they go back to their ward, back to their department, so how they can make things better. So Chair With Me First, yeah, really, really wonderful project. I wish we could get funding to roll it out across the whole country.
Oh.
But, you know.
Well, you never know. You never know.
Yeah, you never know.
So I was looking through the, sorry, Chris, because I was looking through the questions that Chris had written out, and she'd written out loads. And I've got to ask you this one, because it's important that we get it in. You got nominated for an OBE, and you actually have OBE after your name.
I do. And it was such a surprise. And I didn't quite believe it. I couldn't quite believe it when I opened the letter. But and to be, you know, to read that you've been nominated for an honour for supporting victims of sexual violence and sexual abuse, and you don't see that very often. People get OBEs for all kinds of things, but not very often for supporting survivors of sexual violence and abuse. So that felt really good, and you know, to know that it recognised at that level. And Absolutely. It was a fabulous experience. You know, I have to say, it really was wonderful. You're allowed to take 2 guests, and I've got 4 daughters. So
oh no,
there was a phone number on the bottom of the invite, and I phoned it, and the answer was Buckingham Palace, and it's like, really? Am I phoning Buckingham Palace? But yes, I was. And they were really good. They said, yes, of course, they could all come. And so my daughters came with me, which was wonderful as well. Although they did tease me. So you're going to fall over, Mum. Don't trip when you curtsy, you know, that kind of thing.
Sorry, over to you, Chris.
No, it's all tied in anyway. This is all tied in. So tell us a little bit about Silver Command and APPG. What does all of that mean? And how did it feed into your work, like throughout lockdown and even now?
Okay, so the APPG came before lockdown, and it was something actually that Sarah Champion helped us to set up. So APPG, all-party parliamentary group, and you can set an APPG up for anything. There's one for potatoes, one for beer, and then there are more serious ones as well. You know, you get one APPG on domestic violence and things like that. But just to say, you know, if you get the support of an MP, then they will help you to set up an APPG, but you also need to have support across all parties, and you have to have a minimum number. I think it's about 26 MPs have to sign up to support the APPG. And the one that was set up was for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And I would say that adult survivors often get left by the wayside. There's a lot of focus on rape and sexual assault of adults. And there is quite rightly a lot of focus on children. And then squashed in the middle, you get adult survivors who are, I would say, the largest group of survivors.
Yeah.
That need support and need services. So I was thrilled when we were able to set that up. And we produced 3 reports, which were really excellent, looking at the experiences of adult survivors in accessing services, in gaining justice, and really highlighting the failures of the system to meet the needs of adult survivors. And that was, I think it was 2019 when the reports came out, and then we went into lockdown, and that meant that APPG didn't meet after that. What then happened is the Ministry of Justice set up a Silver Command group, and I suppose in policing terms, they will have Gold Command and Silver Command and Bronze Command, whatever. So they set up a Silver Command group for victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and it was a really influential group. It had a broad membership, lots of national charities, lots of government departments, and the chair, Catherine Hinwood, was excellent. She led that group, and you know, it sort of takes me back to the times when we were, you know, confined to our houses apart from an hour or so a day, and you know, we were meeting every week at that time, and we continued our helpline through that time. We continued our training, and in fact, the support we gave to our member agencies through that time was non-stop. We were sometimes issuing bulletins and updates every day and trying to keep people's spirits up. I would say that we definitely worked harder than ever during the lockdowns, and our member agencies never stopped.
Yeah.
And we were able to feed that into the Silver Command group, which had a direct link then up to the Cabinet Office. And we were able to say, you know, we're continuing to work. There is a huge need. We've got more people coming forward than ever, because all the other services had closed down, statutory services had closed. And so there were, you know, many, many times more people coming forward for voluntary sector services. And Catherine Hinwood was instrumental in representing this need to the Cabinet Office, and they put funding into the sector and funding into victim services. So it was a very effective group. It worked really well. I suppose it was a pandemic response. But it worked really well, and it definitely provided a lot of support for our agencies and for us as we were battling with the huge numbers of people coming forward, and also all the other complications that were happening. People were suffering bereavement, they were suffering illness, and yet, you know, we still had to carry on.
So has that stopped now, and what impact has it had, if it has stopped or changed?
It has changed. It's turned into a sort of voluntary sector stakeholder group, which it's quite large, and it feels, in fairness, it feels a bit unwieldy because it is so large. And there isn't the same drive behind it. You know, I think everyone was probably running on adrenaline through all that time. And so it's probably unrealistic to expect that could continue. But it does feel as though it brought something very new and, you know, certainly a lot of energy. And there was a huge wish to keep it going in the same format, but that wasn't something that happened. And I think, you know, I think that's a shame. I think there are a lot of other things that have come out of that, and a lot of relationships that were developed through that have then gone on to form other things. So it's not that there's nothing there. There's nothing quite the same, but there is a lot of other groups that are meeting and taking things forward.
Now, for time purposes, I'm going to sort of like put a couple of questions together. Now, you are a consultant to ICSA via the VSCP. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement with that? Because obviously you were there before it was even set up. What do you think of the final report. What do you think of the government's response so far? So there's a lot there, but you've got 5 minutes to answer that.
And before you do, can we just, because of acronyms,
abbreviations.
Yes. So ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, and the VSCP is Victims and Survivors
Consultative panel.
That's the word. Thank you. Over to you, Fay.
Oh, thanks. So, I mean, yes, I mean, I'm sure everyone will remember that before ICSA, there were 2 failed public inquiries that didn't go ahead. You know, they had chairs appointed who just weren't going to be accepted by survivor communities for a variety of reasons. And so, you know, as the CEO of the Survivors Trust, I was watching all this happening and getting increasingly frustrated. And so working with colleagues, Chris included, and Lucy Duckworth and various others, we set up a Survivors Alliance to lobby and petition for a statutory inquiry. And the reason for wanting a statutory inquiry was that, you know, if something is set in statute like that, it gives it powers. It gives it powers to bring people to give evidence and to protect evidence. And, you know, we knew that as soon as some of these large institutions knew there was going to be a statutory inquiry, they'd be running the shredders night and day, getting rid of all the evidence. And, you know, we wanted to protect that. And, you know, I think, you know, I will always remember the announcement of the inquiry. You know, I was at the Home Office with a lot of others and met with Theresa May, who then walked across from Portcullis House over into the House of Commons and announced the statutory inquiry. It was a really emotional experience. And once the inquiry was set up, we'd been saying that they needed to involve survivors, and I'm really pleased that as they were setting it up, that was something that they'd obviously taken on board. They'd been holding events, talking to survivors, meeting with survivors, and so they opened up a recruitment process for people to join the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel. Chris, you were in Survivors Alliance and applied as well. I applied, you know, with other people, and we were interviewed and appointed, and then we were put in a room with a bunch of other survivors, some of whom we'd met, some that we hadn't, and sort of left to it really for a little while. So I think they wanted us involved, but didn't quite know what to do with us, I think. And we weren't an easy bunch. We weren't an easy bunch to work with. We didn't like anything they did, really, and made no bones about telling them. But, you know, I suppose, you know, it took up 8 years of our lives, and we eventually got into a place where I think we worked incredibly effectively with the research team, who were fabulous, and the research that the inquiry produced is amazing and, you know, absolutely brilliantly portrays the need. We worked really effectively to set up the Truth Project, advising the inquiry on how to engage effectively with survivors and sensitively. And so it felt like we were able to really add value and bring a lot to the inquiry that they would not have had access to in the same way. So, you know, I suppose now when I think about the final report, it is tinged with a bit of, I don't know whether to call it disappointment or annoyance.
Yeah.
You know, the inquiry costs such an incredible amount of money, but it's not that, it's the emotional energy that went into it, and the survivors who came forward, sometimes, many times, for the first time, to say what had happened, and driven by the desire to make a change and to make things
100%.
different for the next generation, so that we don't have to have another inquiry in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
So I am frustrated at the government's response.
That's very polite, Fay.
They've hardly done anything, to be honest. They definitely haven't done enough, and they're not making moves to look as though they're going to do enough. So I'm not impressed with the mandatory reporting amendment that they've published. I don't think it will make any difference, if at all. And even looking at their own figures, you know, it would maybe increase referrals to children's services by 3%. It's a drop in the ocean. You know, if we think 500,000 children a year are being sexually abused, and we might see 1% more of them, or, you know, it's not good enough.
It's not.
And, you know, I constantly find myself saying that there are so many things where, particularly around child protection and looking after our children, it's just not good enough. Come on.
It's not good enough. And I hate to be the person to say this, but we are running out of time.
We've got loads of questions to answer yet, so I'm going to crack on.
Well, we're at the end of time, so that's...
Well, do you need to go?
I will have to.
Okay, I might carry on then.
Okay.
I know, but I might have to go. What time is it?
Oh no! How dare my co-host and my guest?
It's 3 o'clock.
Leave.
It's 3 o'clock.
It's 3 o'clock.
I have got another meeting, but I'm happy to have another meeting.
We will have to have another podcast because we've got so many different questions to ask you. So we're just going to finish this podcast on the fact that we're deeply disappointed in the way that the current government has handled the ICSA recommendations to date. You know, there's opportunity going forwards for them to change that. And there's opportunity for any new government to step up and change that also. And we would love to have conversations with them about this, either or both. We don't mind. We just need someone to listen and act on ICSA, literally. So we're going to round up today, everyone. And thank you for joining us.
Last
and we
thoughts.
Look forward.
We've got time for last thoughts.
Okay, but we look forward to seeing you all in part 2. Now let's go back to Bev and her last thoughts.
Right. Well, I'm going to say, Fay, first of all, thank you for coming. And I think you've been very polite about ICSA and what hasn't happened. And I will say, as one of the people that did go forward for the Truth Project, because obviously Chris made me very aware about it, as you say, it's that emotional impact, you know, and what that led to for many people. I know I also went to the police afterwards, and different things that happened. And for no change to happen, because let's be frank, there has been no change from the government. Yeah. I find, and I won't use bad language, but I find it to be appalling. So that's my last thought there, you know, because we have children even today and it's continuing. We have, as you say, adults that are victims, survivors of childhood, and something has to change if we're going to keep children safe in the future. So I'm going to step down now. That's my last thought.
Can I have a final thought as well?
Absolutely, Fay. Go ahead.
It's just that we're not going anywhere.
No.
And we're not going to be quiet.
No. Absolutely not. And that's exactly why, thank you for all that you do. And that's why we do this podcast. So is there anything else you want to say, Fay, before we say goodbye?
No, just thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Always welcome. And Chris, what's your last thought?
I think I've said enough. Join us for part 2, everybody.
And any questions you may have, please feel free to email breakingthecycle2stepforward@gmail.com. And as we said, there'll be more information about the Survivors Trust underneath as well, so you can contact them if you wish. Thank you very much.
Bye everyone for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.